we continue our talk about what it means to live as a scattered sanctuary, to go out with the message of reconciliation with God because of the sacrifice of Jesus. This week we're going to be reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 to 23, which is a letter that Paul wrote to a group of Christians that lived in Corinth. First, a little background on Paul. Paul was born in Tarsus, which was the Roman capital of the province of Cilicia, which is located just north of Israel. Paul was born a Roman citizen, and this is possibly because his grandfather served 25 years or more in the Roman military. In his letters, Paul refers to various Romans as his relatives. So Paul lived in the cultural tradition of being a Roman. In his letters to the Christians in the Greek city of Philippi, Paul also refers to himself as a Hebrew of the Hebrews. And here and in other letters, a Pharisee born to Pharisees. So Paul lived in the religious tradition of a Jew. Now we know that Paul's cultural and religious backgrounds. Let's read a little bit about what Paul has to say to us in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, started at verse 19. Let's read together. Here's what it says. It says, "Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I become like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do this all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings." Now, I was really struggling with what Paul was getting at until God led me to this really good book by D.A. Carson. It's called The Cross and Christian Ministry. And it really talks at length about these verses. And one thing that was really important for me to hear is D.A. says that Paul doesn't lead with his religious or cultural background. And the reason for that is because they'd be a barrier to those that don't share the same religious or cultural history that Paul may have. I know in my life I have a very uniform, what I would consider to be a cultural background. I'm a pretty big genealogy nerd, and I've done some research on close to 2,000 of my ancestors, and they can all pretty well be traced back to Western Europe and the various areas around there. And for the most part, all of them had made their way to North America, some as early as 2 boats after the Mayflower. And so my learned cultural tradition tells me that those I interact with tend to be those with a uniform cultural background to mine. And so often I've come to realize the music I listen to, the movies I watch, the friends I hang out with, all that stuff tends to reflect my cultural background. A harder thing for me to wrestle through and to admit is that I have a very uniform religious background as well. So when I went through the similar genealogy on these ancestors, it just had all kinds of pastors and elders and missionaries, but sort of uniformly they all came from some kind of Protestant background, whatever that was. And I knew that because right on the census data it tells me what background they had, whether it was Methodist or Baptist or Lutheran or whatever it was, all pretty well in the same camps. And so by the same token, my learned religious tradition sort of tells me that who makes up my church family often becomes a collection of people that have a fairly similar religious background as me. And so often we have to talk about that in our Christian culture too, that the music I listen to, the movies of my childhood, the McGee and Me's and the Salties of the world, and even the friends I made in the church community were very reflective of my religious background. And so much of this has come to light over a summer. I think that we've all had to take some hard looks at how the lens we look through our world, the culture we look through it. And so the experience I had, I work at Ambrose University. And so what we did was every member of the staff and faculty, we basically spent a day going through an assessment of our cultural and religious background and how that shapes how we look at the world. And so it was really eye-opening for me. I think really helped me to remind me that the lens that I may be viewing things, and just one of the pieces there is to move from sort of this minimization into adaptation. And that's what we're talking about this morning, is this idea of being adaptable for Jesus. And so I want to look a little more into Paul and see what exactly makes Paul so adaptable in how he shares the gospel. D.A. Carson explains this way. He says, Paul sees himself in a third position from which he has to adapt to win the Jews on the one hand and the Romans on the other. This is really important for me to see, because what I can see here is Paul is humbly doing everything he can to make sure that his cultural and religious background isn't the stumbling block to win people to Jesus. And it's interesting that the word win is used in here. What does Paul mean when he says win people to Jesus? Well, the word that Paul uses is not a very common word. It can be translated as both win and gain. Really, the only other time Paul uses this word is in Philippians, where he says that everything else is worthless compared to gaining Christ. And so for Paul, knowing Jesus Christ as his Lord had become the only thing that truly mattered to Paul. And so really he's trying to have others experience Jesus as Lord like he's experienced. D.A. in his book, he sort of goes on to explain that we can live in this third position when we embrace the word became. Now, Paul could have gone out here and said, I'm a Jew. That's my religious identity. That's who I am. But instead, he lives in this third person, and he says he became a Jew to win the Jews. The sort of the heading title in the New Living Translation of 1 Corinthians 9 is it says Paul gives up his rights, and I think that's the best title for that. Why does Paul give up his rights as a Roman citizen, as a Pharisee among Pharisees, as a Jew? I believe because doing so, he thinks he can most win people to Jesus. And Jesus is really the ultimate example for this that I can see of someone who lives this, embodies this. Jesus is the hero of our story. He's the example of this. And I just encourage you, even if we think back to our sermon series from a few months ago, it just shows how Jesus is this ultimate example of giving up his rights for us. What it says in Philippians is it says, Jesus made himself nothing, became a servant, humbled himself, and became obedient to death, so that we can be reconciled to God through the sacrifice of Jesus. This reminder is really just highlighted by Paul at the end of this passage here. And I just love what it says here. And it's really the theme of what we've been talking about here. He says, I've become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do this all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. I think there's another important truth to pick up here when he says, I've become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I may save some. He doesn't say here, I would save all. And I think the important distinction here is that what we're called to do, what we're asked to do in obedience out of our love for Jesus, is we're really always the ones being called to say these things, to humbly put our rights aside, put our background, identity, whatever that is, and to put Christ central in our in our lives. And as we're doing that, I think it's just so crucial that we understand that not everyone is going to accept. And I think that's a hard thing often for us as Christians, that we need to come to the realization that God's working in their hearts, and so they're choosing to follow him or not. It's our task is just one of obedience. So I really believe that we need to do everything that we can to humble ourselves, seek to build bridges with people that we may haven't built a bridge before, because maybe some cultural or some religious background. And then that will give us an opportunity to share the life-changing truth of the gospel with them. And truly, by putting them first, we give them more of an opportunity to be open to the gospel, because we want them to be saved. We do this so that we can share in the blessing of the life-changing gospel of Jesus Christ. Let's pray. God, I just thank you for your word. God, this is challenging. This is a challenging passage because, God, it speaks at often the heart of who we think our identity is, whether that's religious or cultural or what that is. And God, I pray for each one of us that even today we would, just like you did, Jesus, we would, in humility, just cast our own agenda or perspectives or whatever to the side, God, and that we would just focus on you, that we would just humbly seek to be that. And God, I thank you for our community, for those that are just watching wherever and whenever that may be, God, that your word would be impacting them, and your word would be changing lives. And we give you all the glory for what you're going to do. We just pray things in your name. Amen. Thanks.